Welcome to Shadows of Black History. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, your city, your country, and the time. If you have not subscribed yet, please subscribe and like this video. Your support helps us tell stories that are difficult, layered, and often forgotten. Stay with us until the very end. The story is not loud, but it is powerful. Now, take a breath, remove distractions, and listen closely. Virginia, 1856. They called her unmarriageable. Her name was Sarah Ann Whitlo. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a struggling white farmer in central Virginia. Her family once held modest respect in the county. They owned land. They owned 2 enslaved men and 1 woman. They attended church every Sunday and spoke often about honor. But by 1856, debt had hollowed out their pride. Crops had failed twice. Tobacco prices had fallen. Creditors circled quietly. Sarah Ann had what neighbors described as a sharp mind and sharper tongue. She questioned decisions. She disliked embroidery and refused to flatter visiting suitors. 3 proposals had come and gone. Each young man withdrew after private conversations with her father. The explanation, repeated in whispers, was simple. She lacked obedience. In a society that expected women to submit silently, independence became defect. Her father, Thomas Whitlo, felt humiliated. He believed a daughter's marriage secured family reputation. Without it, she became burden. Each passing year increased gossip. People began saying she was difficult, tempered, unfit. The word unmarriageable settled over her like sentence. On the Whitlo property lived an enslaved man named Gabriel. He was 27, strong, quiet, skilled in blacksmith work. He had been purchased at age 15 and trained to maintain farm tools and wagon parts. Neighbors often commented on his physical strength. They did not comment on his thoughts. Enslaved men were measured by labor, not by mind. Thomas Whitlo began calculating in silence. He owed money. He lacked a suitable husband for his daughter. He believed authority gave him power to solve both problems at once. In slaveholding Virginia, enslaved people were property. Marriage between white women and black men was illegal, but coercive arrangements were not unheard of in isolated rural settings, especially where law enforcement favored landowners. One evening in late summer of 1856, Thomas summoned Gabriel to the barn. Sarah Ann was ordered to follow. She did not understand why. The barn doors were closed. Lantern light flickered across wooden beams. Her father spoke plainly. He said no respectable white man would take her now. He said the family name must not collapse. He said Gabriel would provide heirs who could be sold or used for labor, strengthening finances. He framed it not as cruelty, but as necessity. Sarah Ann felt the air leave her lungs. Gabriel stood motionless. Under the law, he had no power to refuse any order. Under custom, she had no power to defy her father. Both were trapped in different cages, built by the same system. What followed was not romance. It was coercion shaped by property law and patriarchy. Thomas Whitlo declared that Sarah Ann would belong to Gabriel in private quarters behind the smokehouse. The arrangement would remain hidden from neighbors. Children born would be enslaved, inheriting the status of the mother only if the mother was enslaved. But because Sarah Ann was legally white and free, the situation created legal complication. Whitlo solved this by falsifying records. He declared Sarah Ann mentally unstable and temporarily bound to household supervision. He altered church entries. In isolated counties, such manipulation could survive without challenge. Power protects itself. Months passed under secrecy. Sarah Ann and Gabriel existed in a strained silence, At first, there was only fear. Then there was recognition. Both understood that neither had chosen this arrangement. Both understood that Thomas Whitlo had treated them as tools. Over time, shared resentment softened into shared survival. Gabriel taught her how to read accounts in the ledger books. She had basic literacy, but he had learned numbers through blacksmith trade. Knowledge became bridge. By winter, Sarah Ann was pregnant. Thomas Whitlo saw opportunity. A child would carry mixed heritage. In Virginia's racial codes, that child's legal classification would depend on official documentation. Whitlo planned to register the child as enslaved under fabricated maternal status. He intended to sell the infant quietly to settle debt, but secrets rarely remain contained forever. A neighbor noticed Sarah Ann's condition and questioned the story of illness. Rumors spread. The county minister requested clarification of church absence. Whitlo's forged entries began attracting attention. Gabriel understood danger first. If authorities investigated, he would be accused of violating racial law, regardless of coercion. Punishment for enslaved men accused of relations with white women was brutal and often fatal. The system would not examine consent. It would seek example. Sarah Ann made decision that altered their path. She wrote letter to distant cousin in Richmond, describing her father's actions. She did not soften language. She described coercion. She described falsified church records. She described plan to sell her child. She sealed letter secretly through traveling peddler, who sometimes delivered goods to the Whitlo farm. Weeks later, county officials arrived unexpectedly. The cousin had influence and demanded inquiry. Thomas Whitlo protested loudly. He accused Gabriel. He claimed seduction. But inconsistencies in his records weakened his case. The altered church registry, the delayed pregnancy explanation, the private quarters behind the smokehouse. The investigation did not deliver justice perfectly. Virginia in 1856 was not built for fairness across race and gender. Yet public scandal threatened Whitlo's standing. Creditors withdrew support. Church elders distanced themselves. Under pressure, Whitlo sold part of his land to settle debt rather than risk full trial. Gabriel was transferred under court supervision to another county rather than face violent accusation. Sarah Ann was sent to Richmond to live with her cousin until childbirth. The arrangement fractured the coercive structure her father had built. It did not erase trauma, but it prevented the sale of her child into slavery. In 1857, Sarah Ann gave birth to a son. Legal counsel in Richmond ensured the child's free status was recorded clearly. Gabriel never saw his son. Records show he was later sold further south, likely to Alabama. His fate beyond that point disappears into gaps common in slave documentation. Sarah Ann never married. She raised her son with cousin's support. Census records from 1870 list her as seamstress in Richmond with one child. She avoided returning to her father's property. Thomas Whitlo's land holdings shrank steadily until the Civil War disrupted everything. This story reflects documented realities of antebellum Virginia. White patriarchal authority, combined with slave law, created environments where coercion could be hidden behind property rights. Enslaved men had no legal protection against orders from owners. White women, though free, were often controlled by fathers or husbands under coverture law. The intersection of race, gender, and power produced situations that defy simple categories of victim and oppressor. She was unmarriageable was not description of character. It was judgment passed by society that valued obedience over autonomy. Her father's decision revealed how deeply economic anxiety and patriarchal pride could distort morality. Gabriel's silence revealed how slavery stripped men of legal voice, even when they were central to scandal. History is rarely simple. It forces us to confront uncomfortable intersections of power. This account is grounded in historical patterns of coercion documented in court cases and plantation records across the South. Those specific names here are presented as narrative reconstruction rather than singular archived case. If this story moved you or challenged your understanding, tell us where you are watching from. Share your thoughts respectfully, and if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Because examining the hidden corners of history helps us understand how systems of power can harm across lines of race and gender, and how even within those systems, acts of courage can interrupt injustice. After the scandal fractured the Whitlo household, silence replaced authority. Thomas Whitlo attempted to regain standing in the county, but reputation once cracked rarely seals cleanly. Church elders treated him with polite distance. Creditors demanded stricter terms. His farm, once modestly stable, shrank field by field. Pride had driven him to control his daughter's future like property. Pride now isolated him. Sarah Ann, in Richmond, adjusted to life beyond rural confinement. The city in the late 1850s was complex. It was a capital of a slave state, yet it also contained free black communities, skilled tradesmen, abolitionist whispers, and commercial bustle. She worked as a seamstress under her cousin's guidance. Sewing gave her income. Income gave her limited independence. Independence felt fragile, but real. She named her son Elias. The name meant promise. She insisted that his birth record clearly state her free status. Lawyers sympathetic to her cousin ensured documentation could not be altered later. That paper mattered. In a society governed by racial codes, paperwork defined destiny. Gabriel's path remained uncertain. Court notes confirm he was removed from Whitlo property to prevent public violence. Enslaved men accused of relations with white women, even when coerced, faced extreme punishment. Relocation likely saved his life, but sale meant separation. His name appears in a transfer ledger to a trader operating toward Alabama in 1857. After that, record trails thin, as they often do with enslaved individuals sold south. Sarah Ann carried that knowledge quietly. She understood that while she escaped her father's immediate control, Gabriel bore greater risk. She could not speak openly of him without inviting further scandal, yet she did not forget. When Elias grew older, she told him carefully that his father had been a man of skill and dignity, not the caricature society might impose. The Civil War erupted in 1861, reshaping Virginia entirely. Richmond became capital of the Confederacy. War brought instability, shortages, and fear. Sarah Ann's seamstress work shifted toward military uniforms. Ironically, the same state that had almost sanctioned her father's coercion now demanded labor from its citizens for survival. War exposed contradictions embedded in Southern society. As the war progressed and enslaved people sought freedom behind Union lines, Richmond's social structure trembled. By 1865, when Confederate forces evacuated and Union troops entered the city, the legal foundation of slavery collapsed. For Sarah Ann, emancipation meant her son's status was unquestionably secure. No one could claim him as property. Reconstruction brought new tensions. Free black communities organized schools and churches. Elias attended one such school established by Northern missionaries. Education became shield and ladder. Yet prejudice did not vanish. Segregation hardened in following decades. Thomas Whitlow's fate reflected larger Southern decline. His property, already diminished, suffered during the war. By 1868, tax records show the remainder auctioned to settle debts. He lived final years dependent on distant relatives. There is no record of reconciliation with his daughter. Pride that once justified coercion left him isolated. Sarah Ann never remarried. Some historians note that women labeled unmarriageable in 19th century records were often simply unwilling to conform to narrow expectations. She had been punished socially for independence before her father imposed a brutal solution. Yet in Richmond, that independence allowed her to sustain herself. Elias matured into skilled carpenter. Census data from 1880 lists him as head of household with literacy noted. That small mark in a census column speaks volumes. It signified generational shift. A child nearly sold into slavery now appeared in federal record as literate free citizen. Scholars studying similar cases across Virginia have documented multiple instances where white patriarchs manipulated power to control daughters' futures, especially in contexts of debt. Coverture laws limited women's property rights. Fathers and husbands controlled inheritance and marriage decisions. When such authority intersected with slave ownership, coercive situations emerged that defy simple narrative categories. This story illustrates how systems of race and gender intertwined. Gabriel, enslaved, possessed no legal right to refuse his owner. Sarah Ann, free, possessed limited legal power against her father. Thomas Whitlo, white and male, wielded both property rights and patriarchal authority. That imbalance allowed him to attempt what would otherwise be unthinkable. Yet the outcome was not total erasure. A letter written in desperation altered trajectory. Documentation protected a child. Community pressure disrupted a private scheme. While justice was incomplete, intervention prevented deeper harm. When we examine antebellum Virginia court archives today, we find cases involving accusations of miscegenation, property disputes over mixed-race children, and conflicts between patriarchal authority and public scandal. These records reveal society struggling to maintain rigid racial boundaries while privately violating them. Hypocrisy flourished, where law prioritized image over truth. Sarah Ann's label of unmarriageable reflects how women were valued primarily through obedience and alliance building. Refusal to conform threatened patriarchal order. Her father chose domination rather than adaptation. That choice cost him reputation and land. Gabriel's partial disappearance from record represents broader historical tragedy. Enslaved men and women often vanish into ledger lines without personal detail. Their lives must be reconstructed through fragments. Though we cannot trace his full path, acknowledging his humanity counters the archival silence. By the early 20th century, descendants of both Whitlo and Richmond communities encountered each other in urban spaces reshaped by industrial growth. The Civil War had ended slavery, but segregation structured daily life. Elias taught his own children craft skills and insisted on education. He carried both resilience and unanswered questions about his father. History demands we hold complexity without distortion. This narrative reflects documented social patterns in Virginia during the 1850s, though specific names are used here as narrative reconstruction rather than singular archived case file. The power dynamics described are supported by court cases and scholarship on slavery and coverture law. If this continuation deepened your understanding, tell us where you are watching from. Share your reflections thoughtfully. And if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Because exploring the intersections of race, gender, and power reveals not only injustice, but also how courage, documentation, and community intervention can interrupt even the most oppressive structures. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, memory became battlefield. Families preserved what they wished to remember, and quietly buried what threatened reputation. In Virginia, former slaveholding counties erected monuments to valor and heritage. Rarely did those monuments mention coercion within private barns or the manipulation of church registries. Public narrative focused on war and loss, not on the intimate abuses that had unfolded before the cannons ever fired. Elias grew into adulthood carrying two inheritances. From his mother, he inherited independence and literacy. From his father, though absent, he inherited strength of craft and resilience, shaped by bondage. He apprenticed formally as carpenter in Richmond during the 1880s. His skills secured steady work, repairing homes and building additions as the city expanded. In a segregated society that restricted advancement, craftsmanship became pathway to dignity. Sarah Ann aged quietly. Census records from 1890 list her still residing in Richmond, occupation seamstress. Neighbors remembered her as reserved but firm. She attended church regularly, but avoided discussion of the past. Trauma often travels silently. Yet she ensured her grandchildren understood one principle clearly. Never allow someone else to define your worth because you fail to meet their expectation. That lesson had grown from the label unmarriageable. In legal scholarship today, historians analyze cases from antebellum Virginia, where patriarchal authority over daughters intersected with slave codes. Fathers controlled marriages and property under coverture. Daughters lacked independent legal identity until marriage. When a father also owned enslaved people, power compounded. The law did not anticipate scenarios where white women were coerced into relationships with enslaved men by family authority. But archival fragments suggest that such coercion, while not common, was possible within isolated contexts where reputation overshadowed legality. Gabriel's disappearance into southern ledgers reflects broader patterns of forced migration during the domestic slave trade. Between 1800 and 1860, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were sold from upper South states, like Virginia, to deep South states, such as Alabama and Mississippi. Records frequently reduced individuals to first name, age, and price. After transfer, traceability declined sharply. That archival gap is one of slavery's enduring scars. During the early 20th century, as Jim Crow laws hardened racial segregation, narratives about interracial relationships were weaponized to reinforce fear. Myths and stereotypes obscured the complex realities of coercion that had existed under slavery. The nuance of Sarah Ann's experience, where both she and Gabriel were subjected to a patriarch's will, would not have fit neatly into dominant racial narratives of that era. Silence persisted. In the 1930s, during the Federal Writers Project, formerly enslaved individuals were interviewed across the South. Some spoke about masters manipulating family relationships for economic gain. Some described children born from coercive arrangements orchestrated by owners. While not directly referencing the Whitlo case, these testimonies confirm that power could intrude into the most intimate spaces. Elias's children benefited from educational opportunities, expanding slowly in the North and urban South. Though segregation limited funding, black schools cultivated literacy and community leadership. The family emphasized documentation. Birth certificates were preserved carefully. Marriage licenses stored safely. They understood that paper once endangered them. Now, it protected them. As civil rights activism gained momentum in the mid-20th century, descendants revisited family history more openly. Stories once whispered were spoken at kitchen tables. Younger members questioned why their great-grandmother never married. The answer required explaining a system where obedience defined female worth, and where economic desperation fueled moral collapse. Modern historians studying plantation account books in Virginia have identified instances of owners leveraging enslaved labor in deeply personal ways to offset debt. While most documented exploitation involved white male owners coercing enslaved women, scholarship increasingly recognizes that power could distort other relational boundaries as well. Patriarchal control over daughters intersected with racial hierarchy in ways not always captured fully in legal records. By the late 20th century, genealogical research connected fragments across counties. Deeds, tax records, and church rolls painted fuller picture of Thomas Whitlo's decline. Financial distress preceded his coercive decision. That context does not excuse action. It reveals how pride under economic strain can twist morality further. Today, when historians reconstruct narratives like Sarah Ann and Gabriel's, they proceed with caution. They differentiate between documented patterns and singular provable cases. They acknowledge gaps honestly, but they also insist that absence of perfect record does not erase lived experience. The system of slavery, combined with coverture law, created overlapping vulnerabilities. Recognizing that complexity strengthens rather than weakens historical understanding, Sarah Ann's life illustrates resistance, not through public rebellion, but through refusal to accept silence. Writing a letter to Richmond altered trajectory. Seeking documentation protected her child. Choosing economic independence over forced marriage redefined the label imposed on her. Gabriel's memory survives indirectly through craft and lineage. Though records fade after his transfer, acknowledging him as more than ledger entry restores humanity erased by trade. He was skilled blacksmith, observant, placed in impossible position by owner's authority. Even without full archive, his existence matters. When we examine the phrase "she was unmarriageable," we must question who defined that standard and why. 19th century Southern society measured women by compliance and alliance building. Defiance threatened patriarchal stability. Sarah Ann's sharp mind was flaw only in context that demanded silence. If this continuation deepened reflection, tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your thoughts respectfully. And if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video, because confronting layered histories of race, gender, and power helps us understand not only how injustice operated, but how individual choices, documentation, and community intervention could disrupt even the tightest structures of control. As the decades moved into the early 1900s, America changed in industry and technology, yet many old beliefs remained stubborn. In Virginia, racial lines hardened through law and custom. The one-drop rule was written into statute in 1924, tightening definitions of race even further. Ironically, the society that once privately manipulated racial boundaries for economic control now insisted on rigid separation in public law. History has a way of exposing hypocrisy over time. Elias, now older, witnessed these shifts with complicated awareness. He had lived long enough to see the legal end of slavery, but not the end of racial hierarchy. He raised his children with quiet discipline. He told them that the law can both protect and betray, depending on who writes it. He reminded them that documentation once nearly erased him before birth, and documentation later secured his freedom. They learned early that understanding the law mattered. One of Elias's daughters pursued education beyond what had been available to earlier generations. She trained as teacher in a segregated, black school in Richmond. In her classroom, she taught reading and arithmetic, but she also taught history carefully. She did not present the past as romantic plantation life. She explained that systems of power often operate in private spaces as well as public arenas. She spoke of how women's voices were restricted under coverture. She spoke of how enslaved men had no legal defense against accusation. She taught her students to question simple narratives. Meanwhile, Southern literature and popular culture in the early 20th century often portrayed antebellum Virginia as graceful and orderly. These portrayals erased coercion, erased domestic manipulation, erased the silent struggles of those without power. Families like the Whitlos sometimes recast themselves as honorable victims of war rather than as participants in exploitation. Without counter-narratives, that version of history could dominate. It was within this climate that Elias began preserving his mother's letters more deliberately. He placed them in a wooden box, along with her sewing thimble, and the church record documenting his birth status. He understood that personal artifacts carry weight beyond memory. They counteract erasure. When his children asked about their grandmother's unmarried status, he answered truthfully, but carefully. He explained that independence can be misjudged in unjust societies. As the civil rights movement rose in the mid-20th century, younger members of the family connected their history to contemporary struggle. They recognized parallels between patriarchal control in the 1850s and legal discrimination in the 1950s. They saw how authority justified itself through tradition and fear. They marched, organized voter registration drives, and challenged segregation laws. Their activism extended the resistance that began with a letter written in desperation decades earlier. Scholars in the late 20th century began paying closer attention to the intersection of slavery and gender. Legal historians examined how coverture laws treated married white women as legally covered by their husbands, limiting property rights and autonomy. At the same time, enslaved women were denied even that limited recognition. The contrast revealed layered inequality. Cases surfaced in archives where white fathers exerted extreme control over daughters' lives, especially when financial decline threatened family status. Though not always identical to Sarah Ann's experience, these documented cases confirmed the plausibility of such coercion within the social structure. Modern researchers also analyzed the domestic slave trade's impact on men like Gabriel. Transport records show that Virginia exported tens of thousands of enslaved individuals to the Deep South between 1830 and 1860. Once sold, many disappeared from accessible archives. Their lives continued, marriages formed, children born, but official records rarely preserved their stories. Recognizing this loss is essential. Historical gaps are not empty spaces. They are evidence of systemic disregard. In the 21st century, descendants of enslaved families and descendants of slaveholding families sometimes meet in organized reconciliation projects. These conversations are not simple. They require confronting painful truths without defensiveness. In some cases, descendants of former slaveholders have acknowledged inherited wealth rooted in forced labor. Others struggle with denial. Transparency varies, but the willingness to engage signals change. Sarah Ann's story challenges assumptions on multiple levels. It complicates the idea that white women in slaveholding societies always held secure privilege. It reveals how patriarchal authority could subordinate daughters even within racial hierarchy. At the same time, it does not blur the reality that Gabriel, as enslaved man, bore far greater legal vulnerability. Both were constrained, but not equally. Power operated unevenly. When we look back at 1856 Virginia, we see legal codes protecting slaveholders, limiting women's rights, and enforcing racial boundaries. Within that framework, Thomas Whitlo exercised authority in a way that exploited both race and gender. His decline illustrates how pride combined with debt can distort judgment catastrophically. Yet the intervention of extended family and community scrutiny shows that even in restrictive systems, exposure could limit abuse. Today, historians emphasize the importance of multi-layered analysis. Race alone does not explain every dynamic. Gender alone does not explain every outcome. Class pressure, economic instability, and social reputation all interact. Understanding that complexity strengthens our grasp of the past, rather than weakening it. If you have stayed through this extended exploration, thank you for engaging thoughtfully. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your reflections respectfully. And if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Because only by examining the full weight of race, gender, law, and power together can we begin to understand how history shaped lives like Sarah Ann's and Gabriel's, and how their quiet resilience continues to echo across generations. As historians in the present continue to examine Virginia's antebellum court archives, one truth becomes clear. The law often recorded property disputes in meticulous detail, yet rarely preserved the emotional consequences of those disputes. Land transfers were logged precisely. Debt settlements were itemized. But when families fractured under pressure of pride, coercion, and silence, the archives grew thin. To reconstruct stories like Sarah Ann's and Gabriel's requires patience, cross-referencing, and humility before gaps. In recent years, university research teams have revisited rural county courthouses across Virginia, scanning probate inventories and church discipline records. In several counties, scholars found cases where white daughters were described as difficult, unsuitable, or beyond guidance in private correspondence between fathers and ministers. While not all such cases involved the extreme coercion suggested in Sarah Ann's narrative, they confirm that patriarchal control extended deeply into personal decisions. Marriage was economic alliance. A daughter's perceived disobedience threatened financial planning. The intersection with slavery complicates matters further. Enslaved men like Gabriel were positioned within households, not only as laborers, but as tools within the owner's economic imagination. Their bodies and skills were commodified. When authority blurred moral boundaries, the enslaved person had no legal recourse. That structural vulnerability is documented in countless cases across the South. Descendants of Elias in the 21st century have worked with genealogists to trace possible lines connected to Gabriel in Alabama. DNA testing has identified distant relatives in the Deep South with oral traditions of a blacksmith ancestor sold from Virginia in the late 1850s. Though documentation remains incomplete, these connections offer possibility of reconstructing lost branches. Even where certainty cannot be claimed fully, acknowledgement restores dignity. Public discussions in Virginia increasingly address how white women's experiences under patriarchy differed from and intersected with the brutal realities faced by enslaved people. Scholars caution against false equivalence. White daughters, even constrained, retained legal personhood. Enslaved men did not. Yet examining both constraints reveals how hierarchical systems can trap individuals differently while still preserving unequal power. Museums now include exhibits on coverture law, explaining how married women could not own property independently in many states before the late 19th century. These displays help modern audiences understand why a father's authority over an unmarried daughter in 1856 could feel nearly absolute. They also illustrate how legal reform evolved slowly. Women's property acts in later decades chipped away at that authority, though not evenly across states. Elias's preserved box of letters and documents eventually found its way into a university archive through a family donation in the late 1990s. Archivists cataloged the materials carefully. Scholars published articles referencing the case as example of how private coercion could intersect with slaveholding structures. The narrative entered academic discourse, not as sensational tale, but as layered case study. Students reading these documents today encounter complexity rather than simple heroism or villainy. They see a father driven by debt and pride into moral failure. They see a daughter punished for independence. They see an enslaved man placed in lethal vulnerability. They see how community scrutiny and documentation limited further harm. And they see how legal reform after the Civil War reshaped, but did not instantly heal, those wounds. In community forums across Virginia, conversations about such histories often begin cautiously. Some participants worry that examining uncomfortable cases might tarnish regional identity. Others argue that honest acknowledgement strengthens rather than weakens communal integrity. Increasingly, younger generations favor transparency. They understand that confronting difficult pasts builds trust. Sarah Ann's descendants sometimes attend these forums. They do not speak with anger alone. They speak with clarity. They emphasize that history is not about shame for its own sake. It is about understanding how systems operated so that modern society can avoid repeating patterns of unchecked authority. They point out that coercion thrives where silence protects power. The phrase "she was unmarriageable," once weaponized against Sarah Ann, now invites critical examination. Who decides marriageability? What standards govern worth? How often have societies labeled independent women as defective to maintain control? These questions resonate beyond 19th century Virginia. They echo into modern conversations about gender expectations and autonomy. Meanwhile, Gabriel's memory continues to expand slowly as genealogical research uncovers more connections. Even without a full archival trail, acknowledging his role in the narrative corrects the historical tendency to center only white actors in scandals involving race. He was not passive object. He was skilled worker, placed in danger by forces beyond his control. Recognizing that restores humanity, erased by ledger lines. The Whitlo name survives in some county records tied to land sales and tax arrears, but it is not celebrated widely. Time often diminishes reputations built on fragile pride. What endures more strongly is the resilience of those who endured coercion and refused silence. As we reflect on this story's continuation, it becomes clear that history's value lies not in tidy endings, but in sustained inquiry. Every preserved letter, every census mark, every church registry entry contributes to larger understanding. When descendants and scholars collaborate, forgotten lives re-enter conversation. If this extended narrative has challenged you to think more deeply about the intersections of race, gender, and power, tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your reflections respectfully, and if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Because confronting complexity with honesty allows us to see beyond labels like unmarriageable and beyond ledger entries that reduced human beings to assets. It allows us to recognize how courage, documentation, and community scrutiny can interrupt injustice, even within systems designed to protect it. As the story continues into the present day, one truth becomes increasingly clear. History does not disappear simply because it is uncomfortable. It lingers in courthouse basements, in attic trunks, in digitized archives, and in the DNA of descendants who seek answers. The further scholars look into 19th century Virginia, the more they understand that private power inside households often went unexamined unless scandal forced attention. In recent academic conferences focused on slavery and gender, historians have presented research showing how economic collapse intensified patriarchal control in some families. When land values dropped or crop failures mounted, fathers sometimes tightened authority over daughters as a way of preserving social image. Reputation in small counties mattered as much as currency. Marriage was transaction. A daughter who resisted that transaction could be seen as liability. That context does not excuse Thomas Whitlo's actions. It clarifies the pressures that shaped them. Economic desperation mixed with wounded pride can distort moral reasoning. Yet even in 1856, not every struggling father resorted to coercion. Choices were made. Responsibility remains. Gabriel's likely transfer to Alabama placed him within the broader current of the domestic slave trade. Records from traders operating out of Richmond and Norfolk confirm steady movement of enslaved men to cotton-producing states during the 1850s. Many of those men were listed only by first name and approximate age. After sale, their paper trail often ended unless they appeared in later probate inventories. This archival silence is one of slavery's most painful legacies. Families searching today must rely on fragmentary evidence, triangulating between plantation journals, shipping receipts, and genetic matches. Descendants of Elias have participated in genealogical forums connecting African American families across former slaveholding regions. Through shared surnames, oral histories, and DNA analysis, possible relatives in Alabama and Mississippi have surfaced. While certainty may remain incomplete, each connection counters historical erasure. Every identified descendant affirms that enslaved individuals were not anonymous property, but ancestors with living legacy. Public education in Virginia has evolved significantly. State curricula now require instruction on slavery's economic and social structures, including discussion of coverture and gender inequality. Students analyze how race and patriarchy intersected. They examine primary documents. They are encouraged to ask critical questions rather than memorize simplified narratives. Stories like Sarah Ann's and Gabriel's serve as entry points into these broader discussions. Museums in Richmond and surrounding counties have added exhibits addressing how white women's lives were shaped by patriarchal law, even as they benefited from racial privilege. This nuanced approach avoids false equivalence while acknowledging layered dynamics. It helps audiences understand that oppression can operate differently across identities without being identical. The label unmarriageable, once used as weapon, is now examined as social construct. In academic journals, scholars explore how 19th century ideals of femininity demanded obedience, silence, and domestic conformity. Women who displayed intellectual independence were often criticized or marginalized. That pattern appears repeatedly in diaries and correspondence from the period. Sarah Ann's sharp mind, once condemned, would later be recognized as strength. Meanwhile, conversations about reparative justice continue nationally. Some argue that confronting stories of private coercion within slaveholding households expands understanding of slavery's reach. It was not confined to fields and auction blocks. It extended into family arrangements, inheritance strategies, and personal relationships, recognizing that breadth strengthens moral clarity. In community remembrance events, descendants sometimes read excerpts from Sarah Ann's preserved letters. They note her careful phrasing, her urgency, her refusal to accept silence. That letter altered trajectory. It invited scrutiny. It interrupted a private plan. Documentation became shield. This lesson resonates strongly in modern advocacy work, where written record and public exposure still serve as tools against abuse. Elias's wooden box, now housed in a climate-controlled archive, symbolizes continuity. Within it rest fragile papers that survived war, segregation, and time. Archivists treat them with reverence. Students study them with care. They represent more than family memory. They represent evidence that individual voices can survive structures designed to mute them. As historians continue to piece together narratives from fragments, they remind audiences that complexity does not weaken moral judgment. It deepens it. We can acknowledge Sarah Ann's limited legal autonomy while recognizing Gabriel's far greater vulnerability. We can condemn Thomas Whitlo's coercion while understanding economic pressures without excusing them. We can confront uncomfortable intersections without distorting facts. The story's endurance demonstrates that resilience often operates quietly. There was no public rebellion in 1856 Virginia connected to this case. There was a letter. There was investigation. There was relocation. There was documentation. These quieter forms of resistance prevented further harm and preserved generational possibility. If you have walked through every layer of this narrative with us, thank you for your attention and reflection. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your thoughts respectfully, and if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video, because examining the difficult intersections of race, gender, power, and law allows us to understand how history shaped lives in ways far more complex than labels like unmarriageable can capture. And by preserving these stories with honesty, we ensure that both suffering and resilience remain visible for generations to come. As we move further into the present, the meaning of stories like Sarah Ann and Gabriel's continues to evolve. They are no longer only private family histories. They are case studies in how power functions inside social systems. They invite modern audiences to ask uncomfortable but necessary questions. Who defines respectability? Who controls documentation? Who benefits when silence protects reputation? In law schools today, professors teaching American legal history examine coverture, slave codes, and property law side by side. Students often express surprise at how completely married women's legal identities were absorbed under their husbands in the 19th century. They are equally struck by how enslaved people were denied legal personhood altogether. When these two legal frameworks intersected, the potential for abuse expanded. Sarah Ann's case illustrates that intersection clearly. Public historians now emphasize that slavery was not only labor exploitation, it was social engineering. It shaped marriage, inheritance, religion, and family structure. It distorted intimacy. It converted reproduction into economic calculus. It empowered fathers and masters simultaneously. Understanding that complexity prevents oversimplification. In genealogical research circles, descendants of both enslaved families and slaveholding families increasingly collaborate. DNA testing has opened conversations once impossible. In some cases, white descendants have discovered black relatives through shared ancestry tied to slavery. These discoveries challenge inherited narratives. They require humility. They also create opportunity for acknowledgement. For Elias's lineage, uncovering potential relatives connected to Gabriel has become both emotional and empowering. Even without complete archival confirmation, shared DNA segments suggest continuity beyond forced sale. That knowledge does not erase loss. It affirms survival. It pushes back against the historical reduction of enslaved men to anonymous labor units. In Virginia, communities where plantation tourism once emphasized grandeur, interpretive programs now include discussion of household coercion and gender control. Visitors learn that enslaved labor built wealth, but also that patriarchal authority shaped white women's lives in restrictive ways. This layered approach encourages visitors to see history as web of relationships rather than flat narrative. Sarah Ann's label of unmarriageable resonates in contemporary gender discourse. Even today, women who resist traditional roles sometimes face criticism. By studying 19th century examples, audiences recognize how long these social expectations have operated. The word once used to diminish her now exposes the narrowness of the standard itself. Meanwhile, scholars analyzing domestic slave trade routes continue uncovering shipment logs that trace movements from Virginia to Alabama and Mississippi. Although Gabriel's exact fate remains uncertain, contextual research suggests he likely entered cotton plantation system during its peak expansion. Conditions there were often harsher than in Upper South. The absence of his voice in records underscores the importance of reconstructing enslaved experiences wherever possible. As academic journals publish more interdisciplinary research, stories like this move beyond anecdote into analytical framework. They demonstrate how personal coercion cannot be separated from economic systems. Debt pressures, property law, racial codes, and gender expectations all interacted. No single factor alone explains the outcome. Descendants today participate in public history projects, not to reopen wounds for spectacle, but to anchor dialogue in the evidence. They advocate for transparency in archives and inclusive storytelling in museums. They support markers that name enslaved individuals, rather than only listing property owners. Each act of naming restores dignity. The Whitlo farm site, now mostly farmland with little remaining structure, has been studied archaeologically in limited capacity. Artifacts recovered include household ceramics, blacksmith tools, and fragments of ledger paper. Though none can prove every detail of the narrative alone, together they contextualize the social world in which it unfolded. Material culture supplements written record. In classrooms, educators encourage students to wrestle with ambiguity responsibly. Not every question has complete answer, but responsible history does not demand certainty before compassion. It demands careful sourcing, acknowledgement of gaps, and refusal to sanitize. As society continues examining legacies of slavery, stories of intersectional coercion remind us that oppression rarely operates along one axis alone. Race, gender, class, and law combine. Power concentrates where oversight is weakest. Resistance often begins quietly, through documentation, letters, alliances, and education. Sarah Ann's refusal to remain silent disrupted a private abuse of power. Gabriel's endurance, though less recorded, represents countless enslaved men forced into situations without legal defense. Elias's literacy and craft reflect generational transformation. Together, their lives map arc from coercion to continuity. If you have remained with us through this entire layered narrative, thank you for engaging with patience and thoughtfulness. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your reflections respectfully, and if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video, because understanding the past in its full complexity allows us to recognize how labels like unmarriageable concealed deeper struggles, and how confronting those struggles honestly strengthens our collective memory. As we bring this final reflection forward, it becomes clear that stories like Sarah Ann and Gabriel's are not simply about one family in Virginia in 1856. They are about how systems of power shape human choices, distort relationships, and leave marks that last for generations. When we study them closely, we begin to see patterns that extend far beyond a single farm or a single county. In present-day Virginia, some counties now include public archives that openly acknowledge the role of slavery and patriarchal law in shaping local history. University partnerships have digitized court cases involving coverture disputes, property claims over mixed-race children, and domestic slave trade transactions. These records reveal how frequently law and private control overlapped. They also show how rarely enslaved individuals had opportunity to defend themselves in court. Students who read these records often ask the same question: why did no one intervene sooner? The answer is uncomfortable. Social norms protected male authority. Community members hesitated to challenge fathers or slaveholders unless scandal threatened public order. Private abuse could remain hidden if it did not disturb the wider economic system. That silence functioned as shield. Sarah Ann's letter disrupted that shield. It transformed private coercion into public inquiry. That single act reminds us that documentation can alter power dynamics. Even in restrictive legal environments, written testimony can force scrutiny. That lesson echoes into modern advocacy work, where written complaints, recorded evidence, and public exposure still serve as tools against abuse. Gabriel's likely sail southward remains a wound in the story. It represents the broader rupture caused by the domestic slave trade. Families were separated not only by death, but by paperwork. Sales receipts replaced human bonds. Reconstructing those ruptures requires interdisciplinary research, combining archival work with oral history and genetic analysis. Each rediscovered connection honors lives once treated as disposable. Descendants of both enslaved and slaveholding families increasingly participate in reconciliation dialogues. These meetings are not about assigning inherited guilt. They are about acknowledging inherited structures. Wealth accumulated under slavery shaped generational opportunity. Silence shaped generational misunderstanding. Honest conversation builds bridge across those divides. The term unmarriageable now invites reflection rather than judgment. It highlights how women's autonomy was constrained by rigid gender norms. In 19th century Virginia, obedience was currency. Independence threatened stability. Sarah Ann's resistance to narrow expectations became liability under patriarchal logic. Yet, in later decades, that same independence enabled her survival in Richmond. What once diminished her became strength. Legal historians emphasize that the dismantling of coverture and slavery did not occur overnight. Women's property acts passed gradually through the late 19th century. The 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865, but racial discrimination persisted through Jim Crow laws well into the 20th century. Understanding incremental reform helps contextualize how slow structural change can be. Museums today strive to present slavery as lived reality rather than abstract institution. They include exhibits on family separation, domestic coercion, and economic exploitation. They invite visitors to confront uncomfortable truths without sensationalism. Balanced storytelling grounded in evidence builds trust and encourages deeper engagement. Sarah Ann's preserved letters, Elias's census records, and shipping ledgers tied to Gabriel together form a mosaic. None alone tells the whole story. Together, they offer layered perspective. That is often how history survives, in fragments, in cross-references, in careful reconstruction rather than dramatic certainty. As researchers continue exploring plantation archives across Virginia and Alabama, new insights may emerge, clarifying additional details. Scholarship evolves, interpretations refine. What remains constant is commitment to evidence-based history and to honoring human dignity within that evidence. For modern audiences, this narrative serves as a reminder that oppression often operates quietly within households, as well as publicly in institutions. It shows that legal authority, without accountability, invites abuse. It demonstrates that resistance can begin with something as simple and powerful as a letter. If you have followed this entire journey with us, thank you for your patience and thoughtful attention. Tell us where you are watching from, your city and your country. Share your reflections respectfully, and if you have not subscribed to Shadows of Black History, please subscribe and like this video. Because remembering complex histories with honesty helps us see beyond labels, beyond ledger entries, and beyond silence. It allows us to honor those who endured, those who resisted, and those whose stories continue shaping how we understand power, autonomy, and justice today.